G'day, ZD here. Last Epoch is an action RPG currently in beta development, and in this video I wanted to go over the deterministic crafting system that the game currently has and kind of discuss a little bit some of its potential implications for the future. So in Last Epoch, some basics first. Items can have up to 4 affixes, 2 prefixes and 2 suffixes, and they can go to 5 different tiers of affixes that are craftable. So you can see a tier 2 increased damage over time there, and over here you can see a tier 5 health roll on this amulet. Now, to ensure that there are chase drop items as well as the crafted items in the game, since this crafting system is very powerful, there's also this system of exalted items which can drop with tier 6 or 7 levels of affixes, and these are only obtainable as drops. So you can see a tier 6 minion health here, which is substantially higher than tier 5 craftable minion health, and over here we have a tier 6 health as well, which is 113 on that roll, compared to the tier 5 here that goes up to 88 at the top end. Now, the crafting system is primarily fueled by this system of affix shards, which you can obtain as drops. You can see a bunch on the ground here, and one of the best things in this game is if I click one, it picks them all up. Love that feature. These affix shards can also be easily stored in vast quantities over in your forge, which is the crafting bench effectively that's accessible anywhere. So you can just open the menu to access that. And you can see over here, I've got like 212 armor shards and 155 health shards since I've been playing the beta for this game for quite a while now. You can also more deterministically find affix shards that you want by taking items that have affixes that you want. So for example, the block chance on this shield is a good affix that I might want to craft shields in the future. And then using these runes of shatterings, which you can buy from vendors or get as drops, and then you can break the item down for a chance to receive 1 shard per affix and affix tier. But if I shatter this, it'll say I created 1 shard, which is a necrotic resistance shard, so we didn't get the block chance in that case. But that allows you to at least somewhat deterministically farm certain affix shards by keeping an eye out for items with specific affixes that you want that you can shatter and break down so that you can store those affix shards for future crafting. So the way the system works is when you have an item that you want to craft or improve, you'll take it and put it in the forge, and then you'll be able to add, if there's an open space for a suffix or prefix, one of the affixes that you want, as long as you have a shard for it, or improve the tiers of specific affixes. So for example, if I wanted to improve damage over time from up to tier 4 to tier 5, the highest craftable, I could add a damage over time affix shard to attempt to do so. I could also take a suffix and apply a missing suffix to try and finish this item up, so maybe I really need lightning resistance, and I can specifically add lightning resistance to this item. Now obviously, being able to target and even improve affixes with extreme specificity like this is extremely powerful. As such, there needs to be some sort of counter to this, and there we have the stability system, or the instability system, and the risk of damaging the item in various different ways. So each time we craft a new affix on an item, it'll increase in instability. So you can see down the bottom here, applying lightning resistance to this item will add 5 crafting instability to the item. And if we look at this amulet, it already has 12. And this is just a natural drop, but because it has some pretty high tier affixes on it, it starts with a little bit of instability. As you add more and more instability to an item, it becomes increasingly risky to continue doing further crafts to the item, whether it's adding new affixes or increasing affix tiers. Also, trying to increase affix tiers for affixes that are already pretty high, for example, this tier 4 damage over time, are inherently more risky as well. So just to add, say, poison resistance, a new suffix at tier 1, which isn't, super powerful, it's just the first tier of it, is I have a 12% chance for a minor fracture, whereas if I try and add a tier to bring it to tier 5 damage over time, that's quite a bit more risky. We have a higher chance of a minor fracture and a chance of a damaging fracture as well. So this is the system where if you keep pushing crafting an item, you'll have more and more chance of having either a minor, damaging, or destructive fracture. And what those do, a minor fracture locks the item, so you can't do any further crafting to it. So that's like usually a reasonable outcome. If you get a pretty good item in the end and then minor fracture it, locking it, you're like, okay, I'm done with this particular item. It's as good as it can get for now. But we didn't go backwards at all. We ended up with the result we had at that point, and we couldn't go any further. So that's generally a fairly good outcome as long as you make it a decent way into crafting the item. The next thing is the damaging fractures, which will take one of the random affixes on the item and lower it by 1 to 2 tiers and then lock the item. So your item gets a little bit worse and then becomes locked, so that's obviously a worse outcome. And then the worst possible outcome is a destructive fracture, which takes 2 or more affixes and reduces them by 1 to 2 tiers, so heavily damaging the item, in some cases making it not worth using, or reducing its value and effect pretty dramatically. So as we add more and more affixes and increase their tiers, more and more instability is added to the item. That adds up, and the chance of minor, damaging, and destructive fractures goes up each time. Now, there is another flip side to this, because there is also a chance for a critical success. This was added to the game somewhat recently, and that means whenever you add an affix, there's a chance to add one more tier without adding any extra instability. So whenever that happens, that's obviously a very nice outcome, because you get the item a little further along without making further crafts more risky as well. Something that's worth noting is that there are affix shards that are like particularly common. Things like armor and even just basic health and resistances are pretty common and easy to get. They can be shattered off various items and found as drops pretty regularly. However, there are some very powerful and rare affixes that you can get. You can only start seeing them at higher levels, or the affixes themselves might not just show up very often, but often they can be quite some powerful effects. A good example would be something like +1 maximum skeletons. That's an affix that you can add to an item, but it's a pretty rare affix. So you're going to treasure those affix shards, and you're going to try and put those on an item that is already pretty good, and you're going to be concerned about potentially damaging it and lowering the tiers of those affixes as you add them. Now, to manage the risk of crafting an item, we have 2 support items that we can use. So the first one is Glyphs of Stability, and what this does is, we saw before we had a 5 crafting instability for adding a new affix. Every affix crafted adds 5 instability. Glyph of Stability simply changes that from a range between 2 and 5. So it adds some extra RNG that works in your favor. So effectively, you might do this when you first start crafting an item as much as you can, or much as you can stomach risking, to effectively make future crafts on the items easier, and make it so that you can possibly take the item further, get closer and closer to the elusive goal of 4 tier 5 affixes, the highest that you can get. So for example, if I wanted to take this amulet, which is like a fairly decent amulet, not exactly for my build or anything, but if I wanted to take that and then say add something like physical resistance to do this extra suffix slot, the risk of fracturing the item here is fairly low, 12% chance. So I might use the Glyph of Stability here to make future crafts easier. So I managed to add physical resistance, and we went up, looks like 3 instability, because I think we were at 12 before, and we're at 15 now. We can see at the top of the item there. So that makes it, that's a pretty good outcome there. I might consider even doing this again, but obviously it's getting more and more risky there. So to increase the physical resistance another tier, so we're at 10% right now, there's a 20% chance risk of a fracture. So we'll try again with another Glyph of Stability. And we managed to do that, and didn't fracture the item at all, but the risk of doing it even further is getting quite a bit higher now. Now it's a 25% chance for a minor fracture and 5% for damaging, so it's getting quite risky. Once you get to this point when you're crafting an item, you might consider, unless you're feeling in a very gambling mood, you might push a bit further, but you might consider swapping over to Glyphs of the Guardian. And what these do is they effectively shift the negative outcomes down 1 tier. So this will completely get rid of the risk of a minor fracture, and it'll take the 5% chance for a damaging fracture and turn it into 5% chance for a minor fracture instead. So that might be a little bit confusing, but you can look at it down the bottom here. We see 25% minor, 5% damaging. If we select the Glyph of the Guardian, it effectively shifts all of the risks down 1 tier. So we only have 5% chance of a minor fracture, which is a very low risk. So we could even say, take the damage over time and increase that. Since that's a high one, we only have 15% chance of damaging it. If that's a high priority stat for us, we might focus on that one first. Now that one's maxed out, so we can see how much further we can push the item from here. Kind of just being conscious of the potential of breaking the item as the risks increase. We're already at tier 5, since this item dropped pretty well with tier 5 health, and it already had tier 4 damage over time. That's a pretty good starting point for an amulet, potentially. This is obviously not really good base, but just for demonstration purposes. Physical resistance is my next priority, so I'm going to use more of these Glyphs of the Guardian, which these definitely have some value, and when trade is in the game, they'll have a decent amount of value, I imagine, but we can try and increase this as much as we want. Minor fractures I'm not worried about, but as we keep going, even with the Glyphs of the Guardian, you can see what it's like without right now. We actually have 25 minor, 25 damaging, 5 destructive, but with the Glyphs of the Guardian bringing it down to 5% damaging fracture. Now this is still pretty worth risking at this point. However, we did minor fracture the item, so we can see fractured, minor fractured. So we didn't make it to tier 5 physical resistance, but we did end up with tier 5 damage over time, tier 5 health, tier 4 physical resistance. Pretty good outcome overall. We almost made it to triple tier 5, which is actually pretty impressive. Now, this instability system is pretty harsh, and it wouldn't work in other games with other crafting systems, but I think it works pretty well here. specifically because this crafting system is incredibly powerful. You have to have a pretty hard, I think, counterpoint to something that allows you to very specifically target and add and improve affix tiers like this. I don't know yet how this is going to work long-term balance-wise, whether this will be like a harsh enough counter to the power of this crafting system, but right now it seems to work at least fairly well in a solo self-found environment. Longer term, the chase is obviously going to be to try and find rare and elusive bases, effectively, exalted items like this. Now, this isn't a very good base because a copper ring isn't a good base to begin with, but it did roll tier 6 exalted health, which is, again, that really high health roll, and tier 4 minion damage, so this actually makes a pretty good item to craft as well. If only the base ring itself was a little better, like, for example, one of the turquoise rings that I'm wearing with minion damage and health could potentially be an insanely good item, but already this is a pretty nice item. Now, first, we might consider adding extra affixes, or we might try and shoot straight for the tier 5 minion damage, although there is a little bit of chance of risk there. Typically, we want to do Glyphs of Stability first, so we're going to try and find things that we want to add, and Elemental Resistance is a pretty good option. Same things like Physical Resistance, maybe we really want to scale Intelligence, things like that. What am I using? I've got minion damage, minion health, endurance. Let's go ahead and add some endurance threshold, which is a mitigation mechanic in this game. Effectively, it's an amount of your health, which you take a certain amount of percent mitigation based on the stats you stack. Doesn't really matter besides the point right now, but we'll take our endurance threshold and use our Glyphs of Stability first, and hopefully don't fracture the item. I might even add another prefix here. So now that we have one more prefix, we might add, say, intelligence to this item, I think. Scrolling through the options we have, I think intelligence is a fair option here. Intelligence is not particularly high value, but I will go ahead and add that. And I'm not really, because this item is very valuable, I'm not really going to risk any more Glyphs of Stability. So instead, we're going to try and focus on the most important things, which is that minion damage. Only 13% chance for a minor fracture now. Managed to tier 5 that, so now we have tier 5 minion damage, tier 6 health. And then we're going to try and increase these other affixes as much as we can. We'll just see how far we can push this item without breaking it. I'm going to focus on the endurance threshold first, I think. Okay, I think I might swap over to intelligence now and bring that up a little bit. And we ended up fracturing there. It was a pretty low fracture chance as well, so it's a little bit unfortunate. But still a fairly good item at this point. Unfortunately, we only got one intelligence. As you can see though, just kind of sitting here and just twiddling around with this crafting system for examples, we ended up crafting some very powerful gear, and even this is a nice upgrade for me right now. Now, there are other things you can do as well. Room of Refinements are effectively your Divine Orb. They allow you to reroll the affix ranges within the tiers. So, for example, with our Exalted item, if I hadn't bricked it, maybe if the health was a bit lower, we would have pushed it up. It's already pretty high, so that's actually pretty good. But the minion damage is very low roll, so we might have been able to push that up. Doing these crafts also does add instability as well, so something you have to keep in mind. Trying to perfect the item, divining its rolls up effectively, is going to be risky as well long term. Rune of Removal to remove an affix, but adding instability. So if you've got a really good item, but it's got one affix you need to get rid of to replace with something else, you can gamble with the Rune of Removal. And Rune of Cleansing, which reduces instability between 5 and 15, and removes all the affixes from an item. So this is kind of a more specific case, I think more solo self-foundish. Like, you find a base that you really have been looking for and haven't been able to find, but the affixes on it are garbage and you just want to start fresh. You can go ahead and remove this and then try and craft the item. It's a little bit of a kind of, you're starting at a bit of a disadvantage in terms of pushing the item as far as possible, but it might still be good enough to kind of get you going and get you the gear you need. In my experience, you often end up in a bit of a situation where you are wearing a full set of fractured rares that you have pushed as far as possible. So let's just take a look at my random character that I loaded up here. It's like a level 80 necro. We've got like tier 3, tier 3, tier 4, tier 1 helmet here that I tried to craft. Good base. Stats didn't roll super well, but still fairly good and quite usable. A pretty nice shield here with tier 5 block chance, some health gained on block, damage taken on block, health. Note that all of these items have been fractured. Most of them minor fractures, occasionally a damaging fracture that was still good enough to use. We've got a fractured ring over here with minion health and damage, tier 2 health, tier 3 endurance. Got some tier 5 movement speed, prioritizing that, and tier 5 health with a little bit of endurance and intelligence before it fractured. We got some minion damage, very high intelligence, some endurance, some elemental resistance to try and shore up those resistances. We've got these kind of like average level of items here, which is like tier 2, tier 2, tier 3, tier 2 of all relevant stats. Like, I don't have any stats on my gear typically that I don't want in my build, but because of this, how powerful this crafting system is, even just starting from white items, you can often make something like this quite easily. But pushing to all like 4 tier 5 items is quite difficult. You need a really strong starting point, like this amulet we were working with here before. Now, obviously, the throwing fire damage taken thing is not exactly what we want for our build, but say it was, then we had found a pretty good item here that we actually could have pushed quite far. And we did even end up managed pushing this quite far with 2 tier 5 affixes and a tier 4. So getting kind of close to that goal of 4 tier 5 affixes. It's difficult but doable once you kind of keep an eye out for a while and find some items that have already a good starting point, or for example, exalted items. It's a really, really interesting system. It's exceedingly powerful, and I'm very curious to see how it will go in the game in the future. Right now, as I said before, it works quite well in a solo self-found scenario. You can craft like very usable gear quite easily, and you can push to even some fairly decent gear with a little bit of patience and a little bit of gambling. But I'm very curious to see how this goes once multiplayer is added to the game, because right now there is no multiplayer in trading, but that is set to come to the game quite soon. It'll be pretty interesting to see how such a powerful system works in a multiplayer trading scenario, because not only will we be able to trade for crafting resources, including like rare affixes that otherwise might be a bottleneck to your crafting, but also you're going to be able to trade for bases that are really good starting points. You saw how well we did with a fairly good starting point here with a tier 5 and a tier 4 affix. We ended up tier 5, tier 5, tier 4. Pretty good outcome. Imagine if we can go to trade and look for items that other people have dropped where they have, 3 tier 4 affixes that you want and a tier 3 affix that you want. Like, it's a really good starting point. You only have to manage a couple of pseudo-risky crafts in order to reach the maximum possible crafted outcome. Or even buying exalted bases that have a good other affix. So you've got like a tier 7 exalted affix and a tier 4 or 5 other good affix, and then it's just about kind of finishing the item off at that point. So there's definitely going to be some potential to make some, potentially even somewhat consistently, make some very powerful items. Now, it'll continue to be hard to perfect items in solo self-found, but I can foresee in a trading situation where you can do that, where you can trade for those bases with other people, then that's going to make for some pretty powerful crafts. It's also going to potentially, because they've talked about doing like a more of a bartery sort of, or a market bazaar style trading system, which remains to be seen exactly how it's implemented, but depending on how powerful the trading itself is, it might be really also fun to look for specific crafting bases, trying to hunt down like a really good elusive, or coming across a shop that has a really good crafting base and getting very excited about that, because you'll be able to craft something very good with it, even if there is like a little bit of risk involved. So I'm very curious to see how that will all play out, and how will the devs end up balancing around this? Will it be pretty expected in a trading economy that everybody's going to be running around with items with 4 tier 5 affixes? Or will the trading system be less powerful to compensate for how powerful the crafting system is? Is that a good outcome in the end? Maybe it's more fun that way, for a trading system to be less powerful, but the crafting system to be more powerful, rather than the flip side, where the trading system is very powerful and most of your stuff is acquired by trading, but maybe the crafting system is less powerful. Lots of interesting questions, and I'm very curious to see how the game develops in the future, especially once trading is enabled, whether the crafting system ends up getting nerfed or whether it stays like this, and how it interacts with that crafting system I'm very curious to see. Anyway, I'm curious about any of your thoughts about generally deterministic crafting, trading, the interactions between the two and things like that. But that is going to be it for now. I'm Ziggy D, and thanks very much for watching.